Vietnam, officially the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, is the easternmost country on the Indochina Peninsula in Southeast Asia, with an estimated 90.5 million inhabitants as of 2014. It is the world's 13th most populous country, and the 8th most populous Asian country. The name Vietnam translates as Southern Viet. It was first officially adopted in 1802 by Emperor Long, and was adopted again in 1945 with the founding of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh. The country is bordered by China to the north, Laos to the northwest, Cambodia to the southwest, and Malaysia across the South China Sea to the southeast. Its capital city has been Hanoi since the reunification of North and South Vietnam in 1976. Vietnam was part of Imperial China for over a millennium, from 111 BC to AD 939. The Vietnamese became independent in 939, following the Vietnamese victory in the Battle of Bac Thi Chang River. Successive Vietnamese royal dynasties flourished as the nation expanded geographically and politically into Southeast Asia, until the Indochina Peninsula was colonized by the French in the mid-19th century. Following a Japanese occupation in the 1940s, the Vietnamese fought French rule in the First Indochina War, eventually expelling the French in 1954. Thereafter, Vietnam was divided politically into two rival states, North and South Vietnam. Conflict between the two sides intensified, with heavy intervention from the United States, in what is known as the Vietnam War. The war ended with the North Vietnamese victory in 1975. Vietnam was then unified under a communist government but remained impoverished and politically isolated. In 1986, the government initiated a series of economic and political reforms which began Vietnam's path towards integration into the world economy. By 2000, it had established diplomatic relations with all nations. Since 2000, Vietnam's economic growth rate has been among the highest in the world, and, in 2011, it had the highest global growth generators index among 11 major economies. Its successful economic reforms resulted in its joining the World Trade Organization in 2007. Etymology. The name Vietnam is a variation of Nam Viet, a name that can be traced back to the Trieu dynasty of the 2nd century BC. The word Viet originated as a shortened form of Bac Viet, a word applied to a group of peoples then living in southern China and Vietnam. The form, Vietnam, is first recorded in the 16th century oracular poem Sm Trang Trinh. The name has also been found on 12 steles carved in the 16th and 17th centuries, including one at Bao Lam Pagoda in Haiphong that dates to 1558. Between 1804 and 1813, the name was used officially by Emperor Long. It was revived in the early 20th century by Phan Boi Cho's History of the Loss of Vietnam, and later by the Vietnamese Nationalist Party. The country was usually called Annam until 1945, when both the imperial government in Hue and the Viet Minh government in Hanoi adopted Vietnam. History. Prehistory and ancient history. Archaeological excavations have revealed the existence of humans in what is now Vietnam as early as the Paleolithic age. Homo erectus fossils dating to around 500,000 BC have been found in caves in Lang Son and Nghen provinces in northern Vietnam. The oldest Homo sapiens fossils from mainland Southeast Asia are of Middle Pleistocene provenance, and include isolated tooth fragments from Themom and Hang Hum. Teeth attributed to Homo sapiens from the late Pleistocene have also been found at Dongkan, and from the early Holocene at My Da Du, Langao and Lang Cuom. By about 1000 BC, the development of wet rice cultivation and bronze casting in the Ma River and Red River floodplains led to the flourishing of the Thong Sun culture, notable for its elaborate bronze drums. At this time, the early Vietnamese kingdoms of An Lang and O Lac appeared, and the culture's influence spread to other parts of Southeast Asia, including maritime Southeast Asia, throughout the first millennium BC. Dynastic Vietnam. The Hong Bang dynasty of the Hung kings is considered the first Vietnamese state, known in Vietnamese as Van Lang. In 257 BC, the last Hung king was defeated by Thuc Phan, who consolidated the Lac Viet and Oviet tribes to form the O Lac, proclaiming himself Nduang Vuong. In 207 BC, a Chinese general named Zhao Tuo defeated Nduang Vuong and consolidated O Lac into Nanyue. However, Nanyue was itself incorporated into the empire of the Chinese Han dynasty in 111 BC after the Han-Nanyue War. For the next 1,000 years, Vietnam remained mostly under Chinese rule. Early independence movements, such as those of the Trung Sisters and Lady Trieu, were only temporarily successful, though the region gained a longer period of independence as Van Shan under the anterior Lai dynasty between AD 544 and 602. By the early 10th century, Vietnam had gained autonomy, but not true independence, under the Cook family. In AD 938, the Vietnamese Lord Ngo Quyen defeated the forces of the Chinese southern Han state at Bac Thieng River and achieved full independence for Vietnam. After a millennium of Chinese domination, renamed as Thai Viet, the nation enjoyed a golden era under the Lai and Trn dynasties. During the rule of the Trn dynasty, Thai Viet repelled 3 Mongol invasions. Meanwhile, Buddhism flourished and became the state religion. Following the 1406-7 Ming-Ho War, which overthrew the Ho dynasty, Vietnamese independence was briefly interrupted by the Chinese Ming dynasty, but was restored by La Lai, the founder of the La dynasty. The Vietnamese dynasties reached their zenith in the La dynasty of the 15th century, especially during the reign of Emperor La Thanh Tong. Between the 11th and 18th centuries, Vietnam expanded southward in a process known as Nam Tien, eventually conquering the Kingdom of Kampa and part of the Khmer Empire. From the 16th century onwards, civil strife and frequent political infighting engulfed much of Vietnam. First, the Chinese-supported Mac dynasty challenged the La dynasty's power. After the Mac dynasty was defeated, the La dynasty was nominally reinstalled, but actual power was divided between the northern Trinh lords and the southern Nguyen lords, who engaged in a civil war for more than 4 decades before a truce was called in the 1670s. The division of the country ended a century later when the Tay Son brothers established a new dynasty. However, their rule did not last long, and they were defeated by the remnants of the Nguyen lords, led by Nguyen Anh and aided by the French. Nguyen Anh unified Vietnam, and established the Nguyen dynasty, ruling under the name Gia Long. 1862–1945. French Indochina. Vietnam's independence was gradually eroded by France, aided by large Catholic militias, in a series of military conquests between 1859 and 1885. In 1862, the southern third of the country became the French colony of Cochin China. By 1884, the entire country had come under French rule and was formally integrated into the Union of French Indochina in 1887. The French administration imposed significant political and cultural changes on Vietnamese society. A Western-style system of modern education was developed, and Roman Catholicism was propagated widely. Most French settlers in Indochina were concentrated in Cochin China, particularly in the region of Saigon. The royalistIen Vuong movement rebelled against French rule and was defeated in the 1890s after a decade of resistance. Guerrillas of theIen Vuong movement murdered around a third of Vietnam's Christian population during this period, developing a plantation economy to promote the export of tobacco, indigo, tea and coffee. The French largely ignored increasing calls for Vietnamese self-government and civil rights. A nationalist political movement soon emerged, with leaders such as Phan Boi Chau, Phan Chu Trinh, Phan Thanh Phung, Emperor Ham Nghi and Ho Chi Minh fighting or calling for independence. However, the 1,930 yen by mutiny of the Vietnam Quoc Dan Thang was suppressed easily. The French maintained full control of their colonies until World War II, when the war in the Pacific led to the Japanese invasion of French Indochina in 1940. Afterwards, the Japanese Empire was allowed to station its troops in Vietnam while permitting the pro-Vichy French colonial administration to continue. Japan exploited Vietnam's natural resources to support its military campaigns, culminating in a full-scale takeover of the country in March 1945 and the Vietnamese famine of 1945, which caused up to 2 million deaths. 1946–54. First Indochina War in 1941. The Viet Minh, a communist and nationalist liberation movement, emerged under the Marxist-Leninist revolutionary Ho Chi Minh, who sought independence for Vietnam from France and the end of the Japanese occupation. Following the military defeat of Japan and the fall of its puppet empire of Vietnam in August 1945, the Viet Minh occupied Hanoi and proclaimed a provisional government, which asserted national independence on the 2nd of September. In the same year, the Provisional Government of the French Republic sent the French Far East Expeditionary Corps to restore colonial rule, and the Viet Minh began a guerrilla campaign against the French in late 1946. The resulting First Indochina War lasted until July 1954. The defeat of French and Vietnamese loyalists in the 1954 Battle of Dien Bien Phu allowed Ho Chi Minh to negotiate a ceasefire from a favorable position at the subsequent Geneva Conference. The colonial administration was ended and French Indochina was dissolved under the Geneva Accords of 1954, which separated the loyalist forces from the communists at the 17th parallel north with the Vietnamese demilitarized zone. Two states formed after the partition: Ho Chi Minh's Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the north and Emperor Bao Thai's State of Vietnam in the south. A 300-day period of free movement was permitted, during which almost 1 million Northerners, mainly Catholics, moved south, fearing persecution by the Communists. The partition of Vietnam was not intended to be permanent by the Geneva Accords, which stipulated that Vietnam would be reunited after elections in 1956. However, in 1955, the state of Vietnam's Prime Minister, Ngo Dinh Diem, toppled Bao Thai in a fraudulent referendum organized by his brother Ngo Dinh Nhu, and proclaimed himself President of the Republic of Vietnam. 1954–1975. Vietnam War. The pro-Hanoi Viet Cong began a guerrilla campaign in the late 1950s to overthrow Diem's government. In the north, the communist government launched a land reform program, and executed between 50,000 and 172,000 people in campaigns against wealthy farmers and landowners, amid broader purges. In 1960 and 1962, the Soviet Union and North Vietnam signed treaties providing for further Soviet military support. In the South, Diem went about crushing political and religious opposition, imprisoning or executing tens of thousands. In 1963, Buddhist discontent with Diem's regime erupted into mass demonstrations, leading to a violent government crackdown. This led to the collapse of Diem's relationship with the United States, and ultimately to the 1963 coup in which Diem and Nhu were assassinated. The Diem era was followed by more than a dozen successive military governments. Before the pairing of Air Marshal Nguyen Cao Kentucky and General Nguyen Van Chu took control in mid-1965, Chu gradually outmaneuvered Kentucky and cemented his grip on power in fraudulent elections in 1967 and 1971. Under this political instability, the Communists began to gain ground. To support South Vietnam's struggle against the communist insurgency, the United States began increasing its contribution of military advisors. Using the 1964 Tonkin Gulf incident as a pretext for such intervention, U.S. forces became involved in ground combat operations in 1965, and at their peak they numbered more than 500,000. The U.S. also engaged in a sustained aerial bombing campaign. Meanwhile, China and the Soviet Union provided North Vietnam with significant material aid and 15,000 combat advisors. Communist forces supplying the Viet Cong carried supplies along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which passed through Laos. The Communists attacked South Vietnamese targets during the 1968 Tet Offensive. Although the campaign failed militarily, it shocked the American establishment, and turned U.S. public opinion against the war. Facing an increasing casualty count, rising domestic opposition to the war, and growing international condemnation, the U.S. began withdrawing from ground combat roles in the early 1970s. This process also entailed an unsuccessful effort to strengthen and stabilize South Vietnam. Following the Paris Peace Accords of 27 January 1973, all American combat troops were withdrawn by 29 March 1973. In December 1974, North Vietnam captured the province of Phoc Long and started a full-scale offensive, culminating in the fall of Saigon on 30 April 1975. South Vietnam was briefly ruled by a provisional government while under military occupation by North Vietnam. On 2 July 1976, North and South Vietnam were merged to form the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. The war left Vietnam devastated, with the total death toll standing at between 800,000 and 3.1 million. 1976–present. Reunification and reforms. In the aftermath of the war, under Le Duen's administration, the government embarked on a mass campaign of collectivization of farms and factories. This caused economic chaos and resulted in triple-digit inflation, while national reconstruction efforts progressed slowly. At least 1 million South Vietnamese were sent to re-education camps, with an estimated 165,000 prisoners dying. Between 100,000 and 200,000 South Vietnamese were executed in extrajudicial killings, another 50,000 died performing hard labor in new economic zones. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, millions of people fled the country in crudely built boats, creating an international humanitarian crisis. Hundreds of thousands died at sea. In 1978, the Vietnamese military invaded Cambodia to remove from power the Khmer Rouge, who had been attacking Vietnamese border villages. Vietnam was victorious, installing a government in Cambodia which ruled until 1989. This action worsened relations with the Chinese, who launched a brief incursion into northern Vietnam in 1979. This conflict caused Vietnam to rely even more heavily on Soviet economic and military aid. At the 6th National Congress of the Communist Party of Vietnam in December 1986, reformist politicians replaced the old guard government with new leadership. The reformers were led by 71-year-old Nguyen Van Linh, who became the party's new general secretary. Linh and the reformers implemented a series of free market reforms, known as Thi Moi, which carefully managed the transition from a planned economy to a socialist-oriented market economy. Though the authority of the state remained unchallenged under Thi Moi, the government encouraged private ownership of farms and factories, economic deregulation and foreign investment, while maintaining control over strategic industries. The Vietnamese economy subsequently achieved strong growth in agricultural and industrial production, construction, exports and foreign investment. However, these reforms have also caused a rise in income inequality and gender disparities.